The Line of Golden Light, or The Little Blind Sister, by Elizabeth Harrison. Once upon a time there lived a child whose name was Avila. She was sweet and loving, and fair to look upon, with everything in the world to make her happy. But she had a little blind sister, and Avila could not be perfectly happy as long as her sister's eyes were closed so that she could not see God's beautiful world, nor enjoy his bright sunshine. Little Avila kept wondering if there was not something that she could do which would open this blind sister's eyes. At last, one day, she heard of an old woman, nobody knew how old, who had lived for hundreds of years in a dark cave, not many miles away. This queer, old woman knew a secret enchantment, by means of which the blind could receive their sight. The child Avila asked her parents' permission to make a journey to the cave, in order that she might try to persuade the old woman to tell her this secret. Then, exclaimed she, joyfully, my dear sister need sit no longer in darkness. Her parents gave a somewhat unwilling consent, as they heard many strange and wicked stories about the old woman. At last, however, one fine spring morning, Avila started on her journey. She had a long distance to walk, but the happy thoughts in her heart made the time pass quickly, and the soft, cool breeze seemed to be whispering a song to her all the way. When she came to the mouth of the cave, it looked so dark and forbidding that she almost feared to enter it, but the thought of her little blind sister gave her courage, and she walked in. At first she could see nothing, for all the sunshine was shut out by the frowning rocks that guarded the entrance. Soon, however, she discerned the old woman sitting on a stone chair, spinning a pile of flax into a fine thread. She seemed bent nearly double with age, and her face wore a look of worry and care, which made her appear older. The child Avila came close to her side, and thought, she is so aged that she must be hard of hearing. The old woman did not turn her head, nor stop her spinning. Avila waited a moment, and then took fresh courage, and said, I have come to ask you if you will tell me how I can cure my blind sister. The strange creature turned and stared at her as if she were very much surprised. She then spoke in a deep, hollow voice, so hollow that it sounded as if she had not spoken for a very long time. Oh, said she with a sneer, I can tell you well enough, but you'll not do it. People who can see, trouble themselves very little about those who are blind. This last was said with a sigh, and then she scowled at Avila until the child's heart began to beat very fast. But the thought of her little blind sister made her brave again, and she cried out, oh, please tell me. I will do anything to help my dear sister. The old woman looked long and earnestly at her this time. She then stooped down and searched in the heap of the fine spun thread which lay at her side until she found the end of it. This she held out to the child, saying, take this and carry it all around the world, and when you have done that, come to me and I will show you how your blind sister may be cured. Little Avila thanked her and eagerly seized the tiny thread, and wrapping it carefully around her hand that she might not lose it, turned and hastened out of the close, damp cave. Illustration, Avila ran forward and cried, now give sight to my sister. She had not travelled far before she looked back to be sure the thread had not broken, it was so thin. Imagine her surprise to see that instead of its being a grey thread of spun flax, it was a thread of golden light, that glittered and shone in the sunlight, as if it were made of the most precious stuff on earth. She felt sure now that it must be a magic thread, and that it somehow would help her to cure her blind sister. So she hastened on, glad and happy. Soon, however, she approached a dark, dense forest. No ray of sunlight seemed ever to have fallen on the trunks of its trees. In the distance she thought she could hear the growl of bears and the roar of lions. Her heart almost stopped beating. Oh, I can never go through that gloomy forest, said she to herself, and her eyes filled with tears. She turned to retrace her steps, when the soft breeze which still accompanied her whispered, look at the thread you have been carrying. Look at the golden thread. She looked back, and the bright, tiny line of light seemed to be actually smiling at her, as it stretched across the soft green sward, far into the distance, and, strange to say, each tiny blade of grass which it had touched, had blossomed into a flower. So, as the little girl looked back, she saw a flowery path with a glittering line of golden light running through it. How beautiful, she exclaimed. I did not notice the flowers as I came along, but the enchanted thread will make the next traveler see them. This thought filled her with such joy that she pushed forward into the dark woods. Sometimes she knocked her head against a tree which stood in her way, sometimes she almost feared she was lost, but every now and then she would look back and the sight of the tiny thread of golden light always renewed her courage. Once in a while she felt quite sure that she could see the nose of some wild beast poking out in front of her, but when she came nearer it proved to be the joint in a tree trunk, or some strange fungus which had grown on a low branch. Then she would laugh at her own fear and go on. One of the wonderful things about the mysterious little thread which she carried in her hand was that it seemed to open a path behind it, so that one could easily follow in her footsteps without stumbling over fallen trees, or bumping against living ones. Every now and then a grey squirrel would frisk by her in a friendly fashion, as if to assure her that she was not alone, even in the twilight of the dark woods. By and by she came to the part of the forest where the trees were less dense, and soon she was out in the glad sunshine again. But now a new difficulty faced her. As far as she could see stretched a low, swampy marsh of wet land. The mud and slime did not look very inviting, but the thought of her little blind sister came to her again, and she bravely plunged into the mire. The dirty, dripping mud clung to her dress and made her feet so heavy that she grew weary lifting them out of it. Sometimes she seemed to be stuck fast, and it was only with a great effort that she could pull out, first one foot, and then the other. A lively green frog hopped along beside her, and seemed to say, in his funny, croaking voice, "Never mind the mud, you'll soon be through it." When she had at last reached the end of the slippery, sticky marsh, and stood once more on firm ground, she looked back at the tiny thread of golden light which trailed along after her. What do you think had happened? Wherever the mysterious and beautiful thread had touched the mud, the water had dried up, and the earth had become firm and hard, so that any other person who might wish to cross the swampy place could walk on firm ground. This made the child of Villa so happy that she began to sing softly to herself. Soon, however, her singing ceased. As the day advanced, the air grew hotter and hotter. The trees had long ago disappeared, and now the grass became parched and dry, until at last she found herself in the midst of a dreary desert. For miles and miles the scorching sand stretched on every side. She could not even find a friendly rock in whose shadow she might rest for a time. The blazing sun hurt her eyes and made her head ache, and the hot sand burned her feet. Still she toiled on, cheered by a swarm of yellow butterflies that fluttered just ahead of her. At last the end of the desert was reached, just as the sun disappeared behind a crimson cloud. Dusty and weary, the child of Villa was about to throw herself down on the ground to rest. As she did so, her eyes turned to look once more at the golden thread which had trailed behind her all day on the hot sand. Lo, and behold, what did she see? Tall shade trees had sprung up along the path she had travelled, and each tiny grain of sand that the wonderful thread had touched was now changed into a diamond, or ruby, or emerald, or some other precious stone. On one side the pathway across the desert shone and glittered, while on the other the graceful trees cast a cool and refreshing shade. Little Avila stood amazed as she looked at the beautiful trees and the sparkling gems. All feeling of weariness was gone. The air now seemed mild and refreshing, and she thought that she could hear in the distance some birds singing their evening songs. One by one the bright stars came out in the quiet sky above her head, as if to keep guard while she slept through the night. The next morning she started forward on her long journey round the world. She travelled quite pleasantly for a while, thinking of how cool and shady the desert path would now be for anyone who might have to travel it, and of the precious jewels she had left for someone else to gather up. She could not stop for them herself. She was too anxious to press forward and finish her task, in order that her little blind sister might the sooner see. After a time she came to some rough rocks stumbled about in great confusion, as if angry giants had hurled them at each other. Soon the path grew steeper and steeper, and the rocks sharper and sharper, until they cut her feet. Before her she could see nothing but more rocks until they piled themselves into a great mountain, which frowned down upon her, as much as to say, "How dare you attempt to climb to my summit?" The brave child hesitated. Just then 2 strong eagles with outspread wings rose from their nest of sticks on the side of a steep cliff nearby, and soared majestically and slowly aloft. As they passed far above her head they uttered a loud cry which seemed to say, "Be brave and strong and you shall meet us at the mountain top." Sometimes the ragged edges of the rocks tore her dress, and sometimes they caught the tiny golden thread, and tangled it so that she had to turn back and loosen it from their hold. The road was very steep and she was compelled to sit down every few minutes and get her breath. Still she climbed on, keeping the soaring eagles always in sight. As she neared the top, she turned and looked back at the enchanted thread of golden light which she had carried through all the long, strange journey. Another marvelous thing had happened. The rugged path of sharp, broken rocks had changed into broad and beautiful white marble steps, over which trailed the shining thread of light. She knew that she had made a pathway up this difficult mountain and her heart rejoiced. She turned again to proceed on her journey, when, Only a short distance in front of her, she saw the dark cave in which lived the strange old woman who had bidden her carry the line of light around the world. She hastened forward, and on entering the cave, she saw the old creature, almost bent double, still spinning the mysterious thread. Avila ran forward and cried out, "I have done all you told me to do, now give sight to my sister." The old woman sprang to her feet, seized the thread of golden light and exclaimed, at last, I am freed. The spell has now been broken." Then came so strange and wonderful a change that Avila could hardly believe her own eyes. Instead of the ugly, cross-looking old crone, there stood a beautiful princess, with long golden hair, and tender blue eyes, her face radiant with joy. Her story was soon told. Hundreds of years ago she had been changed into the bent old woman, and shut up in the dark cave on the mountainside, because she, a daughter of the king, had been selfish and idle, thinking only of herself, and her punishment had been that she must remain thus disguised and separated from all companions and friends until she could find someone who would be generous and brave enough to take the long, dangerous journey around the world for the sake of others. Her mother had been a fairy princess and had taught her many things which we mortals have yet to learn. She showed the child Avila how, by dipping the golden thread into a spring of ordinary water, she could change the water into golden water, which glittered and sparkled like liquid sunshine. Filling a pitcher with this, they hastened together to where the little blind sister sat in darkness waiting for someone to come and lead her home. The beautiful princess told Avila to dip her hands into the bowl of enchanted water, and then press them upon the closed eyes of her sister. They opened, and the little blind girl could see. After that the fairy princess came and lived with little Avila and her sister, and taught them how to do many wonderful things, of which I have not time to tell you today. From In Storyland, by Elizabeth Harrison, used by permission of the publishers, the National Kindergarten and Elementary College, 2944 Michigan Boulevard, Chicago, Ill.